In the next few weeks, you'll be reading a lot of research each week regarding the connections between medicine and the practice of religion and health. As a teacher of research methods, I know that this research will mean more to you if you are able to evaluate the quality of the research. Some research studies are better than others by design, and when reading the report from strong research designs, we have more faith in the results that they present. So evidence is the keystone to state-of-the-art practice of anything that we do, any discipline that we are practicing in. And it comes in a lot of different forms. Some forms of evidence are really good and can be trusted, and others are less trustworthy and must be considered with a little bit less confidence. Therefore, you must be able to recognize and understand the different forms of evidence and the ways in which these forms of evidence are related in terms of their strength. You must also realize that there's no uniform system for evaluating evidence, and so your judgment really becomes important in this. This concept of levels of evidence originally started in the field of medicine. It was called evidence-based medicine, EBM. And so other healthcare fields have kind of adopted this as evidence-based practice, like how do we make our decisions on what we do, the treatments that we give people, the practices that we do. What are the evidence that support the decisions that we make concerning lifestyles and the way that we treat patients or clients. So it's also used in healthcare areas and areas such as education. And this started at the Oxford School of Medicine a few years ago. So whether you're going to complete some research yourself or whether you are just a reader of research, we must become familiar with the research process to the extent that we can evaluate the merits of research findings and determine how they apply to what we do in our lives. First, we need to understand the different types of research design, and we'll be doing that in some other videos more. But this is one that does not need to be so intimidating. It seems like a challenging task, but not so much. And then we need to understand the different measurement techniques. What are we measuring, the methodologies, and the analyses used to address different research questions. So we'll be trying to apply evidence-based practice to our practice, and you'll probably be surprised to learn that many procedures that are taught, in exercise and in medicine and in many healthcare fields are not supported by large amounts of evidence. They're just maybe someone's best guess or anecdotal evidence or something that someone has found to work for them. So we'll be looking at those. So using our evidence-based practice, we can determine which treatments or which lifestyles or which decisions can be trusted and which have maybe more limited value. So we're going to be looking again at the University of Oxford's Center for Evidence-Based Medicine. Their model here is shown in this triangle, and this has been adapted and just tweaked and changed just a little bit in many different ways, but we can still use it for decisions that we make concerning our practices in life. The base of the pyramid is this first green level. The two green levels are the weakest type of evidence. Number 5 level of evidence, which is the weakest, is just expert opinion. And typically a group of experts in a field form an opinion on an issue, and expert opinion is used a lot of times when the research is incomplete or preliminary or it's just not there yet. And so rather they may be the best evidence available at the time. And so they are trying to find the best practices when convincing scientific evidence does not yet exist. Sometimes it's even based on anecdotal evidence. What they have found works for them. So that is the lowest level, the expert opinion. Sometimes it's just all we have. The next level up, also in green, is the case series, or sometimes these are just snapshot pictures, descriptions. Cross-sectional studies is another word for those. But sometimes we just look at, There we go with the case studies. So sometimes we just look at things that are happening right now, or sometimes we just look at a pre-post test, a series of individual study subjects. Maybe they all received the same treatment, like blood pressure medicine or meditation or some treatment that we've given to them. And if they improve, then the researcher says, well, the treatment worked. And like an example, these people all meditated, and so that their blood pressure improved. And that's not a very good quality research design because it doesn't include any experimental controls, and it violates some of the principles of good research design. What else were they doing that could have impacted their blood pressure? That wasn't controlled. Did they change their diet? Did they lose weight? Did they do something else that could have made their blood pressure improve besides just the practice of meditation? So this is a pretty low level of research and not really taken into a lot of, not given a lot of respect. Then we have the individual case control study. We'll talk about case control studies more deeply in another video, but basically a single case control study involves taking a group of patients or a group of people with a condition or a disease, and these are the cases, and it compares them with a group of healthy or normal people that don't have that condition, the controls. So, for example, people with depression versus those people who don't have depression, we can look back and we can see, well, how many of the people who have depression were religious during their lifespan, and how many people who do not have depression have been religious during their lifespan. And so that's called the cases and the controls, or a case control study. Unfortunately, because you're assessing the depression persons have after the depression has already developed, you can't really determine whether their religious practices were different between the groups, if those existed before the depression developed. Thus, you can't conclude whether the religious patterns or the religious practices influenced or caused the depression. So because of this causality, disconnect, or problem, case control studies are considered a lower form of evidence. But again, sometimes they are the best that we have. Now, if you have SR stands for systematic review. If you have a systematic review of case control studies, if several different researchers have done a case control study and found out about the same thing, then we have a little bit more faith in the results of those studies because there's several people that are finding the same results. And that's always the case. Systematic reviews of any kind of studies give them more credibility. So systematic reviews of case control studies are actually give them a lot more strength. The next level of evidence is outcomes research. And outcomes research is not the same as seeing whether people really improved or got healthier. Outcomes research focuses more on whether the people were able to do the treatment or whether they liked it. And so that may have nothing to do with whether they really improved. So people who do a meditative practice, they enjoyed the meditative practice and they were able to stick with it, but it really reduced their blood pressure or make them live longer or give them less depression. That is not determined. So the outcomes research doesn't have quite the clout that some of the higher level researches would have. Next, we come to the individual cohort studies, and this is level 2B. So we're getting a little bit closer to the top of the pyramid where the evidence is getting a little bit stronger. And cohort studies, we'll talk about them later also, but they are a form of an observational study. And observational studies don't manipulate a treatment. They just observe what is. And rather, it studies intact groups or cohorts across time. And so the cohort studies, they identify people who are exposed or not exposed to some kind of a treatment, risk factor for a disease, a lifestyle like religious practices. And these groups of individual persons are followed across time to determine whether they develop a target condition. So do people who are religious over time develop heart disease at a higher rate or a lower rate than people who are not religious across time? So that's a good example. If religious and non-religious people are followed from, let's say, age 40 to age 70, and then see, what is the heart disease rate for each one of those groups at age 70? Which one of them got heart disease more? Do the religious people or the non-religious people have a higher rate of heart disease during that 30-year time period? And although cohort studies can provide pretty strong evidence for a causal relationship or a cause and effect, they can't really establish a true cause and effect relationship because by their very nature, cohort studies can't control those extraneous factors that can influence the outcomes of the study. For example, in the study I mentioned before, extraneous factors such as heredity, just the genes of the people, if they cause heart disease, smoking, their weight, those are not controlled in the study. They're just following these people in a free living condition, and those things are not controlled. So thus, the study can't really support true cause and effect as much as a real experimental study can. Experimental studies provide more rigorous controls on those extraneous factors, thus preventing those competing outcomes. So like, well, maybe this caused it instead of just the religiosity. So that is a valid complaint of the cohort studies. Now, once again, if you get a systematic review of cohort studies and several researchers start finding the same thing, then we're going to start putting more faith in those cohort studies. They're going to have a little bit more clout than just one individual cohort study. So the next level is the all or none study, and those are very few and far between. So in an all or none study, every person who has that treatment has to have the desired outcome, and that just doesn't happen very often. So let's say if every single person who prays to be cured of their heart disease or their cancer is actually cured, then that evidence is pretty convincing. That's all or none. That means prayer probably was instrumental in their cure. Conversely, if none of them were cured, then we could say that that's pretty strong evidence that prayer doesn't help. But as you might imagine, the all or none standard is pretty rigorous, and it also requires large numbers of individual subjects to be conclusive. You couldn't just say this based on, say, 3 or 5 or 10 people. So furthermore, individual persons, they rarely respond quite that consistently. So even if you have large numbers respond, a few may not. So then you have to decide what explains those non-responders. What about the ones that didn't improve? And because groups of individuals typically don't respond consistently, all or none studies are pretty rarely used. Instead, experimental studies known as randomized controlled trials are considered the gold standard in determining cause and effect, and we will take a look at those next. So in a randomized controlled trial, and we're talking about an individual one here, just one study done by a group of researchers, they are truly experimental studies. They involve two essential elements, a control group and random assignment of subjects to groups, like a treatment group and a control group. The purpose of the control group is to have a comparison condition that represents what happens when no treatment occurs. So in other words, we would have, this is just not something we can do in a study of religious practice. You cannot randomly assign people to be religious or to not be religious. You're in the religious practice group, you're in the not religious practice group. That would be, that's ludicrous to think you could, and it would be unethical if you even tried to do it. So the purpose of the random assignment is to create groups that are presumed equal on every factor before the treatment is started. And so that whatever the outcome is, better, longer life, better quality of life, then you can say that was caused by the treatment or the religious practice itself. Clearly, we cannot do that in this area. So unfortunately, cause and effect is going to be very hard to establish in studies of religious impact on health because we can't randomly assign people to a religious or a non-religious groups. So most of the studies are correlational in nature, or they just show relationships between, say, religious practice or religiosity or prayer or religious support or whatever we're studying, and the outcomes of better quality of life, longer life, less heart disease, whatever the outcomes we're looking at are. Correlations do show a relationship between religious practice and health, but a correlation does not show cause and effect. And we're going to discuss that in a later video too. Now, we also have, as our very last at the top of the pyramid, a systematic review of randomized control trials. So one randomized control trial is very good evidence, but if you have several put together, that is very, very good evidence indeed. And there's some very good evidence existing in the areas of medicine, religion, and health that show connections or relationships between these, but they're not going to be, usually the randomized controlled trials, they're not going to be true experiments because of the reasons I mentioned before. So now it is time for you to read what the researchers have found about this fascinating topic. I want you to read with a critical eye, and as you read, think what kind of quality your research is, how much faith you can put in the results of it, and also just how you would design a research project yourself around these topics. Hope you enjoy this study.